A young couple become the victims of a terrifying assault.
This crime scene was one of the bloodiest that I've ever seen.
I could see a slash across his throat.
She had several lacerations to her hands as well as to her abdomen.
For law enforcement, one of their biggest priorities was to figure out who would want to do this to either of them.
The evidence seems to point to a jealous stalker.
She had mentioned that a guy named John with dreads had followed her.
He would pop up like in crazy places.
But as the investigation unfolds, detectives begin to question everything about the case.
This trail of blood led to the kitchen.
There was 2 knives missing.
How did the suspect know exactly where to go to get the knife?
It did not make sense to me.
The math just was not mathing. Detectives are starting to believe that John really didn't exist.
January 17th, 2010. It's 3:30 a.m. in Shreveport, Louisiana, when police receive an emergency call from 24-year-old Kimethia Coleman.
Shreveport police, what's your emergency?
Somebody trying to kill my boyfriend.
I gotta kill your boyfriend?
Oh, God!
She's saying that her boyfriend, Brian Spinks, they both have been attacked. This person ran out of the apartment and she doesn't know where he is.
Help me, please. I took the knife out of him. Help me, please.
Okay, he was Sam.
Help me.
Minutes later, officers arrive at the address, where they find 29-year-old Brian Spinks lying motionless by the door.
I could see stab wounds about the head. I could see a slash across his throat. There was a great amount of blood to where when you step into the living room, you could hear the sound of liquid in the carpet.
They were able to quickly establish that Brian was dead.
Kim is screaming hysterically, and she's yelling, "Why would he do this?"
The officers secure the scene and escort Kimethia out of the apartment. They try to calm her down so she can explain what happened.
Kimethia appeared to be in a state of shock. She was covered head to toe in blood, and she was very distraught.
When they asked her who did this, she described a man with dreadlocks in a red shirt. She said he left. She didn't know which direction he went.
And it's normal for a victim or someone who sees a traumatic event not to be able to divulge what occurred right then. She was also injured, so we had to get her treatment and take her to the hospital.
She had several lacerations to her hands as well as to her abdomen and her leg.
As Kimethia is transported to a hospital, homicide detectives arrive to take over the investigation. Before entering the apartment, they speak with 2 potential witnesses.
The initial responding officers had located a vehicle at the apartment complex. The vehicle was stopped and the individuals were contacted and found out to be friends of Miss Kimethia Coleman.
They were with her earlier in the day. They had arrived at the apartment to check on her when she didn't answer her phone. Whenever we interview witnesses, we want to find out anything we can, whatever they know. What type of relationship they have with the victim, what knowledge they have prior to the events that occurred.
For law enforcement, one of their biggest priorities was to figure out who was Brian Spinks, who was Kimethia Coleman, and who would want to hurt them? Who would want to do this to either of them?
Brian Dennis Spinks was born December 15th, 1980 in St. Louis, Missouri. He grew up in a family with a proud history of military service.
Brian was the second child, but the first boy. And subsequently, he had two younger brothers.
His father was in the military. Our mother, she was a DOD, Department of Defense employee for security assistance.
It goes all the way back to his great-grandfather being in the Korean War. My father and my grandfather were both in World War II. And then, of course, me in the Marine Corps.
After high school in 1999, Brian followed the family tradition and enlisted in the Air Force. But before he deployed, his life changed.
I met Brian Spinks, I want to say back in the summer of 2000. It was my senior year of high school. Brian had just joined the Air Force, and he had swung by the high school to help with all the recruiters. Brian was very attractive, and his smile was remarkable. We dated for about 6 months, and I found out I was pregnant with Amani.
In January 2001, Brian became a father, but the romance didn't last.
Of course, military obligations, and I felt alone because the military had number one priority.
He was going to do the full ride. Wouldn't have had a problem getting a job after the Air Force.
Shortly after Monty was born, Brian was gone to Iraq. He took long tours.
He, did what the best he could and spoke to his son when he could, had the relationship with his son's mom. They co-parented.
It was very difficult, especially as Amani started getting older.
When we did spend time together in person, we had a good time. He made me feel loved. And, I cried when he left. But I understand what he was doing. He had to serve his country.
While stationed in Montgomery, he had a daughter with another woman in the Air Force.
Once she became pregnant, she got discharged from the Air Force and went home to, I think, Buffalo, New York. So that was difficult in itself. And Brian only got to see her a few times. They did the best he could from a distance.
But while on deployment, Brian's focus was on the men in his unit.
Brian and I met when I was in the Air Force back in 2002. He and I were both stationed at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. He was kind of the organizer between all of us. We all just kind of meshed because this is the only family that we had. Our families were in different countries, different places, and he made sure that we had a place to come and congregate.
By the time he returned home in 2008, Brian was ready to focus on his family.
When he came home, it was always about Amani.
It was good, He talked, he checked on me. I ain't want for nothing.
At a friend's get-together later that year, Brian met someone new, a young woman named Kimethia Coleman.
Kimethia Coleman was from a small town about 30 minutes outside of Shreveport. Just about everyone who knew her loved her and liked her. She was very popular. Prom queen, homecoming queen, you name it.
Kimethia was a very sweet girl. I talked to her almost every Sunday, and she would always be in church.
Kimethia went on to go to Grambling State University. She chose a life of service as a social worker. She dedicated her life to serving and helping other people.
She was seemed like the almost the perfect girl to introduce to your family and to settle down with. Brian had never been this serious about someone until Kimethia came along.
But little more than a year after they began dating, Brian has been killed by an unknown assailant. And investigators are now questioning two women outside the couple's apartment.
One was a longtime friend, the Kimethia Colemans, and then the second individual was her sister. So the friend advises that she had been at the club with her sister and Miss Coleman downtown in Shreveport.
The women say Kimethia seemed upset that evening, and it had something to do with another man.
She had mentioned to the sisters that a guy named John with dreads had followed her. One of the sisters said that she did see someone at the club with dreads, but a lot of black males at that time wore dreads, and so nothing stood out to her.
They say Brian was also at the club, but neither he nor Kimethia stayed for long.
There's a brief conversation between the two, and Brian leaves. Then the friends notice, minutes later, Kimethia leaves.
And within a few minutes of Kimethia leaving, they left to see if Kimethia's car was still there. Then they didn't see it. So they went to Brian's to make sure she got where she was going. When they got there, they heard the screaming and they saw the police coming and they knew something was terribly wrong.
To detectives, the women appeared genuine in their account of the evening. So the investigation is just beginning.
We didn't have enough to go on, so we needed to speak with Kimethia to find out who is John and get more information on why he followed her to Brian's apartment.
Coming up, evidence reveals the brutality of the attack.
The fact that the knife was broken is indicative of a very powerful or angry strike.
And detectives speak with Kimethia.
Oh, Lord. She got a gentleman that comes back from the kitchen. She
After speaking with Kimethia Coleman's friends about the events leading up to the fatal stabbing of Brian Spinks, investigators turn their attention to the crime scene.
Police are not able to talk to Kim. Her wounds are being tended to, and they're hoping that the scene could give them the answers to this puzzle.
This crime scene was one of the bloodiest that I've ever seen. They observed what they thought to be at least 30 wounds to Brian. The cut from his neck, which almost had decapitated Brian, was what the lethal blow was. The amount of blood in the apartment and the amount of injuries that Brian sustained is indicative of a person with a lot of rage or anger. They have some reason to be mad enough to do that kind of damage and that much damage to another individual.
The murder weapons, a pair of knives found near Brian's body, seem to confirm their assessment.
There was a knife that was intact. There was also another knife that was close by that was a handle, and the blade was located in another part of the living room. The fact that the knife was broken is indicative of a very powerful or angry strike.
This trail of blood led to the kitchen, and they notice that on the kitchen counter is this knife block.
There was 2 knives missing from the knife block that also match the knives that were laying next to Brian Spinks' body.
And now they are able to kind of put the pieces together that these 2 knives came off the kitchen counter.
We did search the front door to see any type of jarring or kick marks or pry marks or anything, and none were located.
They start wondering, how did he get in? Did someone leave a door unlocked?
Police canvassed the apartment complex, but none of the neighbors they speak to saw what happened. That leaves one person who might be able to identify the killer, and she's in the hospital.
Police now find that Kimethia's wounds are not life-threatening, so they are able to talk with her.
Kimethia was brought to the violent crimes office there at the Shreveport Police Department, roughly around 7 a.m.
Obviously, we all know why we're here. We're investigating the stabbing of Brian.
Is he okay?
We'll discuss all that in a minute. Will you talk to us?
Is Brian okay? What's on my mom?
He's dead.
His ass followed me.
Kimethia tells police that she was out on the town. It was a girls' night out.
They went to a couple of different establishments, had a few drinks, and then they ended up at Gigi's. Gigi's is one of the larger clubs in downtown Shreveport. Not long after they got to Gigi's, they saw Brian.
Tell me about that.
We told Ben he got upset and he left.
Kimethia advised us that whenever her and Brian went out separately, that they weren't supposed to meet up at the same club or go to the same places.
They had an agreement that if one comes to the club, the other one has to leave. So Brian leaves.
She said that she decided to go back to Brian's apartment to make sure that everything was cool.
Kimethia advised us that her and Brian were back at his apartment, and they were kind of talking.
All of a sudden, and he stabbed Brian. He had like 2 or 3 knives, and all I know I hit him a couple of times.
She said she tried to jump on him, and he pushed her back. After he finished stabbing Brian, he just gets up and runs off.
You keep saying ass. Who was that?
Kimethia explains that John was a man she'd dated casually in the past, and he seemed to have gotten the wrong idea.
I mean, I told him there would never be anything because I was with him. I was crying. And I mean, after a couple of months, he got the picture, but then he showed back up. He would pop up like in crazy places.
Kimethia stated she saw him at the library. She also saw him near her apartment and later saw him at the club with her friends.
Despite the alarming run-ins with this man over the past month, Kimethia seems strangely unable to provide investigators with any details.
She could never tell us a phone number, or she couldn't even tell us his last name. She stated that he drives different cars and he will call her from different payphones.
And the fact that she can't give us specific information about this John had us starting to question exactly what she was telling us.
Police realized that she could still be in shock. So they decide to go to the cell phones.
They asked Kimethia for permission to go through her cell phone.
There are 3 voicemails on her phone. 2 of them are from friends talking about going out that night and making plans for the night. And then that 3rd voicemail is from Brian.
He left the voicemail in between the time he left the club and the time that she arrived at his apartment. He advised that he was done. He was breaking up with her. Prior to us hearing that, it appeared that her and Brian's relationship was fine.
As the detectives confront her with this voicemail, she changes. Her demeanor changes.
Hey, Kim. Why did he break up with you, Tom?
He didn't break up with me tonight. We always go through this. It's not a big deal.
Officer just left him at the morgue. So yeah, it's a big deal. It's a very big deal.
"4 hours after Brian Spinks was found stabbed to death in his apartment. Investigators have just heard a voicemail from that same night in which he broke up with his girlfriend, Kimethia Coleman. The new information has them questioning if her story of a violent home invasion by a jealous stalker is true.
At that point, she asks to speak to Detective Farquhar alone. They had developed a bit of a rapport, and she trusted him in a way that she hadn't developed trust with the other detectives.
We step outside into a little room to where we can still watch Kimethia and Detective Farquhar in their interview, but Kimethia can't see us.
I was hoping that she would finally confide in me exactly what happened.
We'll get you sleep tonight, girl. Don't be embarrassed, okay? It's just me. They're out of here.
At that point, she started telling me that Brian had, in the past, as well as that night, has hit her and abused her, but she felt that she deserved it, and so she didn't say anything to anyone.
Kimethia stated that they argued in Brian's apartment, that he'd been drinking, he was drunk, and she stated that he grabbed her by the hand, causing a minor bruise, and then Brian grabbed her throat, strangling her.
She said she pushed him off, and that's when he went into the kitchen and got a knife.
Oh, it's harder. You gotta tell me if he comes back from the kitchen.
According to Kimethia, he begins to stab her about the legs and stomach area.
She said she had to do something in order to defend herself in that moment.
So she, at that point, got up, went into the kitchen, got her own knife.
And I was like, if I don't do something, I'll kill you.
So you just kept stabbing. When did his throat get cut? Because it was cut bad.
This time, the guy he called me.
Sean did.
Mm-hmm.
Was he in the apartment when all this happened?
Yes, he did come in, and I was like, I was look for you doing it.
She's changing the story now. It has now gone from John breaking into the apartment and attacking Brian to John walking into the apartment as she and Brian were fighting.
It kind of confused her story. The fact that she brought John back in did not make sense to me.
So he showed up in the middle of y'all fighting?
Mm-hmm.
And what all did he do?
He got the knife and just started jabbing or whatever. I guess he was trying to make it look like I did.
It made no sense to anyone in that room. Like, the math just was not mathing. At this point, detectives are starting to believe that John really didn't exist. The question that the detectives asked was, why didn't you just leave? You're being attacked. You're able to get away, but instead of leaving, you grab a weapon and you come back to the fight.
I was trying to protect myself. I was trying to talk to him, tell him to calm down. I'm like, okay, are you really gonna do this right now?
At that point, I advised Detective Holmes and Agent Dunkel to come back in. I asked Kimethia to repeat what she had told me to them. At that point, she advised for an attorney. So the interview was concluded.
Since it appears the stabbing was a crime of passion, police charge Kimethia Coleman with manslaughter. Under Louisiana state law, they have 72 hours to gather any additional evidence.
Within the 72-hour period, a detective would gather all the pertinent information to corroborate the charge or upgrade it to second-degree murder. And with that being said, they would gather more evidence, talk to more witnesses, talking to anybody that knew her or Brian Spinks and their relationship.
Coming up, witnesses provide troubling new details about events leading up to the murder.
And she threatened to beat his ass there at the club.
And medical analysis casts doubt on Kimethia's story.
The coroner identified 64 stab wounds.
It's hard for me to fathom this incident being self-defense.
It's been nearly 12 hours since Brian Spink's murder, and loved ones have started to learn the tragic news.
I just had randomly come in to my mom's house, and she hung up the phone and she screamed my name, and it was just something about the way she screamed it. And she told me the news that Brian was killed just in the shot.
With Kimethia Coleman in custody, detectives turn their attention to locating the alleged stalker she continues to claim murdered her boyfriend.
Now that Kimethia's story is not making much sense, it's very important for police to rule out the John theory. Police did locate a person that fit John's description. He said he didn't know Kimethia and he didn't know Brian. They weren't able to find any type of evidence on him, no blood, no knife wounds.
With the suspect having to be so close to the victim, it would have been nearly impossible for the person to not have some kind of evidence transfer from the victim to their person.
Blood is very slippery. And when someone is stabbing someone, generally the knife will slip and they will cut themselves during the event. This gentleman that was stopped had no injuries whatsoever on him.
It was very clear this is not John.
Not only are investigators unable to find John, there is no evidence he exists at all.
Surveillance cameras were captured from Gigi's. There was no black male with dreadlocks with a red shirt that was walking around Gigi's, stalking her.
We were unable to locate any witnesses that saw this guy, John, or any video to corroborate Kimethia's statement that she saw him at the club or that she saw him at the library.
It became apparent to police that Kimethia had literally sent them on a goose chase to find another suspect that was non-existent.
The discovery means there were only 2 people in the apartment when the stabbing occurred: Brian and Kimethia.
She stabbed him in a rage. There was no John in the picture whatsoever. But it is better for detectives to still go a little bit further to get more evidence, talk to her family, talk to friends.
I did receive a phone call from Brian's father, and he advised that Brian, within the past couple of weeks, was getting ready to part ways with Kimethia.
His description to me was, "Dad, I'm being smothered." He told me wasn't seeing any other girls, just her. But she was smothering him. And He needed some time away.
She had been pressuring him about marriage, and he didn't feel like he was ready for that.
She was getting up at night, going in his phone, going in his emails, searching the house, going through the drawers, looking for some type of incriminating evidence that he's dating another girl. It progressively got worse, the jealousness and the insecurities.
Brian's loved ones say the tension between him and Kimethia finally reached a breaking point on the night of January 17th.
Air Force OSI detectives interviewed the Brian Spink's friends who went out with him that night. They state that Brian was at Gigi's dancing with a friend, but not intimately or anything of that nature, just a friendly dance with another female. Kimethia sees Brian dancing with this female. She gets enraged and figures this must be a side piece, and they argue.
She threatened to beat his ass there at the club for dancing with someone else.
That night, I saw a different side of Kim that I had never seen before. I had never seen her react this way. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and we sat down with Kim. She said to me, she was like, Shane, I'm sorry. I love him, and, I overreacted. So, and in my mind, the night was over and everything was fine. I had no idea what happened after that until the next morning.
Through all the interviews that we did, we feel that Kimethia was jealous, and that when Brian tried to break it off with her, that it just made her lose her mind. And that if she couldn't have him, no one could.
Police in Shreveport, Louisiana, have arrested Kimethia Coleman for stabbing her boyfriend Brian Spinks to death. But Kimethia insists she was acting in self-defense.
Being that there was accusation of abuse, we pulled up any type of police records, but there were no records between Brian Spinks or Kimethia.
Investigators look to Brian's autopsy to provide definitive answers.
Once the coroner got him down to the morgue and they conducted the autopsy, they identified 64 stab wounds.
When somebody's trying to defend themselves from an attacker, they are trying to de-escalate the situation, trying to put a little distance between them and their attacker just to stop the incident from occurring. It's hard for me to fathom this incident being self-defense.
Detectives are left with, how is it that this 100-pound female was able to overtake this 5'11" muscle-bound male who's in the military?
When we got the autopsy report back, it showed that his blood alcohol level was over twice the legal limit, and that he probably would not have been able to fight back.
Her entire defense on the self-defense side was, he attacked me. There was no way that Brian, with the .174 blood alcohol content, attacked her, walked to the kitchen, came back, and stabbed her.
Kimethia's own injuries also seem to contradict her story.
She first claimed that John had stabbed her, and then she claimed that Brian had stabbed her during their fight in which she was defending herself.
But the Caddo Parish coroner said that they were not penetrating, that they were superficial wounds, which would lead him to believe that they were self-inflicted.
Maybe the murder was not premeditated, But she went to extreme lengths to create evidence, to create the optics that would support her story. She was desperate to stay out of trouble, so much so that she harmed herself.
On January 19th, 2010, less than 72 hours after Brian's murder, prosecutors upgrade Kimethia's charges from manslaughter to second-degree murder.
Second-degree murder is the intentional killing of another person, whereas manslaughter is killing someone in the heat of the moment. The fact that she did 64 stab wounds to him as well as a severe laceration to his throat was more indicative that she meant to kill him.
The behavior they said she displayed wasn't the Kim I know, wasn't the Kim I've talked to. I couldn't believe the viciousness.
A trial date is set, but as her day in court approaches, Kimethia's attorneys introduce a new strategy for her defense.
She pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. There were motions filed. There was a mental evaluation conducted, and she was deemed incompetent to stand trial. She was transferred to a mental health facility for 90 days. At the end of that 90 days, she had a second evaluation.
November 2011, it was determined that Kimethia Coleman was able to stand trial and testify.
On April 23, 2012, Kimethia Coleman's murder trial begins. Despite the results of her psychiatric evaluation, her defense remains the same.
Battered wife syndrome was one of the elements of her insanity defense, that she was beaten enough and that she was abused and endured so much abuse that one day she just couldn't take anymore and she fought back.
The defense tried to paint Brian as an abusive person and tried to claim that he had PTSD because he had served in the Middle East and that he came back and took all of that out on Kimethia.
For prosecutors, the question is whether the jury will believe it.
Only two people know what really occurred during the relationship, and one of them is no longer here to tell their story.
At her murder trial, Kimethia Coleman claims the abuse she suffered at the hands of her boyfriend, Brian Spinks, drove her to commit a desperate act of self-preservation. Police and prosecutors say otherwise.
Throughout the investigation and throughout the preparation for the trial, there was just no evidence that pointed to Brian being an abusive person.
She was saying that he beat on women and he beat on me. Brian wouldn't hit a fly.
Kimethia Coleman is a disturbed female who could not take no from her boyfriend, who did not want to be with her anymore. That's what made her snap.
Prosecutors present Kimethia's 911 call as definitive proof her actions were premeditated.
I went back and listened to that phone call. You can hear Brian in the background. She gets real loud and kind of screams. And if you listen closely, you can hear Brian start to gurgle.
Okay, what's going on there?
I think that is when she delivered the final blow while she was on the phone with 911.
Hearing his voice one last time, crying for help. was truly gut-wrenching.
I can't imagine a human being doing what she did to somebody. What she did was, that man didn't deserve to leave like that.
Who would have thought? A sweet young lady with a future, a loving family. Who would believe she would do such a horrendous crime? I just couldn't believe it. And she turned into another person that night, as if she was possessed.
The jury in this trial deliberated 2 hours, and they came back with a unanimous guilty as charged verdict of second-degree murder.
Kimethia Coleman is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
She will not spend another day in freedom. She'll be locked up, but that still doesn't help his friends and family.
We was trying to plan Amani a big surprise birthday party because it was going to be the first time Brian was in the U.S. when his birthday hit.
She took that from me. The man that was supposed to be my guide through life, you know? Like, she took that, and I can't get that back.
I believe Brian would be extremely proud of his son, of the man that he has become.
I wasn't completely stripped because I got a grandson that reminds me of every time I look at him and talk to him. It's same voice. Brian still is.
We respect what he did in the service, the sacrifice that he made. Great father, willing to do anything for the kids, even though it's from afar.
I still feel his spirit around me. He was a good person, you know? No matter what happened, you know, even how he died, that ain't who he was. My father wasn't abusive. He took care of his kids. I just want people to know that my father was a good man.
Looked incredible. The guys are thrilled. Kirk, I've got more defensive linemen from the Falcons wanting to move their accounts over to us next week. Bring them in, Kirk said, flashing a warm, humble smile. My goal is to make sure you guys never have to worry about a mortgage payment when the knees finally give out. As Atwater left the office, Kirk's smile vanished. He locked his office door, pulled down the blinds, and sat heavily at his computer. The numbers Atwater had just looked at were a complete fabrication. The market had been volatile. The proprietary algorithm was nothing more than high risk, unhedged bets on margin that had gone spectacularly wrong. The reality of the Taurus Fund was a bloodbath. Kirk's hands shook as he opened a web browser. He navigated to the website of a legitimate major brokerage firm. He found a blank template for a monthly investor statement, a generic form meant to help individuals track their own external investments. He downloaded the PDF, converted it to a Word document, and began to type. He typed in fake account balances. He fabricated stock purchases that never happened. He invented dividends that were never paid. He was literally making it up keystroke by keystroke. When he finished, he printed out the fake statements on heavy, expensive paper. He would mail these out to the NFL players, to Roger O'Neal, to Calvin Paris. They would open the envelopes, see the phantom profits, and sleep soundly. But the pressure was building. It was a Ponzi scheme of the highest order, requiring a constant influx of new cash from people like the incoming Falcons players just to pay off the older investors who requested withdrawals. To cope with the mounting terror of his reality, Kirk spent money with a manic, desperate intensity. If he looked rich, he reasoned he was rich. He moved his second wife and son into a massive estate. They didn't just renovate it. They obliterated the back half of the house and spent 5 years rebuilding it with marble floors and fixtures plated in solid gold. His garage became a showroom of excess. A Bentley, a Jaguar, an Aston Martin, a BMW, and a Lamborghini. He was constructing an impenetrable fortress of wealth, hoping the sheer weight of his luxury cars would anchor his floating lies to the ground. We need to throw a party, Kirk told his wife that evening, pouring himself a massive measure of scotch. A wedding reception. The one we never had time for. The biggest this city has ever seen. He needed to project absolute dominance. He needed the investors to see him swimming in capital, so they would never dare ask for their money back. The wedding party was an exercise in sociopathic grandeur. It cost $500,000. The centerpiece of the event was not the bride, nor the band, but 3 massive bars carved entirely out of solid blocks of ice, overflowing with vintage champagne, Maine lobster, and imported sushi. Steve Atwater stood near one of the ice bars, sipping champagne, surrounded by his former teammates. They were laughing, toasting Kirk, reveling in the success of Ema. But nearby, near the edge of the ballroom, One of IMAS internal accountants stood with his arms crossed, watching Kirk hold court. Earlier that week, the accountant had bypassed Kirk's locked computer and dug into the raw brokerage clearing data. He hadn't found the 3% gain Kirk had reported for the month. He had found a 20% loss. Millions of dollars simply vaporized in bad trades. The accountant watched the ice bar slowly dripping onto the marble floor. It was a perfect metaphor for International Management Associates. An impressive, glittering facade melting rapidly under the heat of reality, leaving nothing behind but a cold, wet mess. He decided he would confront Kirk first thing Monday morning. Chapter 6, Fish in a Barrel, Berkeley Corporate Headquarters, Cincinnati to 004. While Kirkwright was trying to freeze time in Atlanta, Stephen Warshak was accelerating it in Ohio. The Better Business Bureau files on Berkeley Premium Nutraceuticals had grown from a folder to a filing cabinet, and from a filing cabinet to a mountain. The complaints numbered in the thousands. Cincinnati Magazine had even published a satirical comic strip mocking Berkeley's impossible cancellation policies, cementing their reputation as the worst corporate citizens in the state. But Stephen didn't care. He was practically untouchable, protected by a fortress of lawyers and the sheer volume of his revenue. Between January and November of that year, he calmly transferred over $24 million from the company coffers directly into his personal bank accounts. He was arrogant. He believed he had outsmarted the system. Inside the executive suites, the culture of exploitation had become a sport. Stephen's nephew, Jason Kosman, a rising star in the company's marketing division, had devised a new strategy to squeeze the last drop of blood from the stone. Kosman sent an email to the executive team outlining the plan. When a customer finally manages to cancel their Insight order, Kosman wrote, his fingers flying across the keyboard, "We don't let them go. We wait a week. Then we have a rep call them back from a spoofed number. The rep pretends to be from a medical clinic or a hospital. The The fake clinic would offer the exact same customer a cheaper, more effective, prescription strength alternative to Insight. The poor customer bites. Kosman's email continued. Thinking he's getting a better deal, he gives his credit card number again. He's actually getting taken for a second time by us. Kosman leaned back, admiring his own sociopathy before typing the concluding sentence. The scheme is beautiful. Customers are fish in a barrel. Man, exploit the shit out of them. He hit send. A few minutes later, Kosman's inbox pinged. It was a reply from Stephen Warshak. Stephen had forwarded Kosman's email to 5 other top executives in the company. Stephen hadn't reprimanded his nephew. He hadn't worried about the blatant, documented admission of wire fraud. In the subject line, Stephen Warshak had typed, "The student has become the teacher. Our company was built on this kind of creative thinking. Thanks for the wake-up call, Jason." It was a digital smoking gun, a monument to hubris. What Stephen Warshak didn't know, as he sat in his marble office counting his millions, was that the complaints hadn't just gone to the Better Business Bureau. They had gone to the state attorney general, and from there, they had quietly trickled up to the federal level. In a windowless room in downtown Cincinnati, agents from the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, the IRS, the FDA, and the FBI had pinned a massive organizational chart to the wall. At the very top, beneath a red circle, was the name Stephen Warshak. They weren't looking into a mix-up with credit card processing. They were building a case for a massive, coordinated criminal enterprise. They were preparing to breach the fortress, and they were bringing 50 armed agents to do it. Book 2, The Collision with Reality. Chapter 7, The Siege of Berkeley. Cincinnati, Ohio, March 16, 2005. The morning of March 16 dawned crisp and unremarkable in Ohio. A perfect slate for Stephen Warshak's usual routine of commanding his sprawling nutraceutical empire. He arrived at the Berkeley headquarters in his custom Mercedes, adjusting his tie as he strode past the manicured lawns. He didn't notice the unmarked vans idling in the adjacent parking lot. He didn't see the tactical gear being strapped on, or the clipboards being checked by stern-faced federal agents. Inside the building, the phones in the call center were already ringing with the usual chorus of frustrated victims trying to reach the elusive Michael Johnson. John Bradley was at his desk, rubbing his temples, preparing for another day of lying on company time. Then the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open, and the world stopped. Federal agents, nobody move! The shout echoed through the cavernous lobby, loud enough to cut through the hum of 500 computers. 50 armed agents from the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, the FBI, the IRS, and the FDA flooded the building in a coordinated, militaristic wave. They wore windbreakers emblazoned with yellow acronyms. Some had their hands resting casually near their holstered weapons. John Bradley froze, his hand hovering over his headset. Across the floor, customer service reps dropped their phones. The relentless ringing of the call center was suddenly drowned out by the thundering boots of law enforcement. Step away from your computers. Do not touch your keyboards. An agent barked, moving swiftly down the aisles. Upstairs, in the executive suite, the door to Stephen Warshak's office was thrust open. 2 IRS agents walked in, flashing badges. Warshak, leaning back in his Italian leather chair, merely blinked. His trademark arrogant smile faltered, but only for a fraction of a second. "Gentlemen," Stephen said, his voice remarkably steady, "to what do I owe this dramatic intrusion? My lawyers are on speed dial. Save the dial, Mr. Warshak," the lead postal inspector replied, slapping a thick, bound document onto the marble desk. "Search warrant. We're taking everything." And they did. For the next 10 hours, the federal government methodically dismantled the illusion Stephen had built. Agents hauled out boxes of files, sweeping the desks clean. They wheeled out 24 executive laptops and unscrewed hard drives from servers. They even seized the unopened mail, thousands of letters of complaint and returned in Zeit bottles. In total, 7 tons of evidence over 13,500 documents were loaded into government trucks. As Stephen was escorted down to the lobby, he saw a sight that finally pierced his armor of arrogance. His mother, the woman who had sat in his damp basement taking those very first orders, was being questioned by an FBI agent. His sister and brother-in-law, both executives in the company, were being detained. The federal prosecutors had brought a 112-count indictment. The charge wasn't poor customer service. It was fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering on a massive, unprecedented scale. The feds allege that between 2001 and 2006, Stephen had stolen $100 million directly from consumers' pockets without their consent. Even as he was placed in the back of a black SUV, Stephen's mind raced. This is just a misunderstanding, he told himself. A bump in the road. We grew too fast. I'll hire the best defense team in the country. I'll pay a fine. This will all magically go away. He couldn't conceptualize the reality that his empire of lies had finally met a wall it couldn't bribe, market, or smile its way through. Chapter 8, The Bottom Line. Atlanta, Georgia, January 2006. The walls of Kirk Wright's world were not breached by federal agents with guns. They were breached by silence. The new year arrived, bringing with it a chilling freeze on the cash flow of International Management Associates. The Ponzi scheme had hit its mathematical limit. There were no new Falcons players, no new doctors, no new marks to feed the beast. Alan Ehrlich, a 71-year-old retired businessman, sat in his study, staring at his computer screen. He had invested heavily with EMA after doing his due diligence. He had called references, read the paperwork, and trusted the glossy brochures. But his recent request for a routine withdrawal had been met with a bizarre string of excuses from Kirk. Ehrlich dialed Kirk's direct line. It rang for times before going to voicemail. He tried the receptionist. Oh, everything's fine, Mr. Ehrlich, the receptionist chirped. though her voice betrayed a tremor of panic. Just a little stress with the year-end tax information. Your money is completely safe, but the money wasn't safe. It was gone. It had evaporated in bad margin calls and melted away in ice bars at $500,000 weddings. Inside the EMA offices, the atmosphere was poisonous. The internal accountants who had discovered the 20% loss were demanding transparency. Kirk, looking haggard, his Brioni suit suddenly looking a size too big, stonewalled them. He produced a single sheet of paper claiming the fund had $155 million in assets, but he physically blocked anyone from examining the underlying data. Steve Atwater felt physically sick. The former NFL powerhouse, a man who had faced down 300-pound linemen without flinching, now felt a cold sweat prickle his neck every time he walked into the office. The current NFL players had banded together. They weren't asking politely anymore. They were demanding their money. Millions of dollars. Kirk brought them into the conference room. He leaned heavily against the mahogany table, looking at the angry faces of the men he had sworn to protect. Guys, listen to me, Kirk pleaded, his smooth baritone cracking. You'll get your money next month. We've had a technical issue with the clearing banks, a routing problem. It's just a clerical error. I give you my word. The players stared at him. They had trusted him because he was one of them, a man of color who had cracked the code of the white-dominated financial elite. Now, looking at Kirk's darting eyes and sweating brow, they saw him for what he was, a man trapped in a burning building of his own making. By mid-February, the excuses ran out. Checks began to bounce across Atlanta. On February 17th, the NFL players took decisive action. They bypassed Kirk entirely and went straight to a judge. Within hours, the judge issued an emergency order freezing every single asset tied to International Management Associates. The SEC, having received a tip months earlier, finally moved in alongside the FBI. They executed a search warrant on the EMA offices. Forensic accountants walked into the luxurious suite expecting to find the complex machinery of a massive hedge fund. Instead, they found a ghost town. They found nice desks, expensive chairs, and empty file cabinets. There was no algorithm. There was no trading floor. More alarmingly, when they reached the CEO's office, they found an empty desk. Kirkwright's computer was missing, and so was Kirk. Chapter 9, The Phantom in the Sun. Miami Beach, Florida, May 2006. The water in the pool at the Ritz-Carlton South Beach was exactly 82 degrees. Kirkwright lay on a padded chaise lounge, a pair of expensive Tom Ford sunglasses shielding his eyes from the blinding Florida sun. He took a sip of a mojito, the condensation dripping down his wrist. He was a fugitive from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the target of a nationwide manhunt, and yet he couldn't let go of the luxury. He was a man addicted to the aesthetic of wealth. For 3 months, he had been a ghost. He bounced between high-end hotels, paying in cash, using aliases, burning through the last reserves of the money he had stolen from men like Roger O'Neill and Calvin Paris. He left his wife in Atlanta to face the angry mobs and the auctioneers who would soon strip her of her gold fixtures and marble floors. Beside his lounge chair sat a cheap, disposable cell phone. He picked it up and dialed a number from memory. Wall Street Journal, investigative desk. A voice answered. "This is Kirk Wright," Kirk said calmly, adjusting his sunglasses. It was an act of pure, unadulterated narcissism. While the FBI turned over every rock in Atlanta, Kirk was giving exclusive telephone interviews to the national press. "Mr. Wright, the authorities consider you a fugitive," the reporter said, the shock evident in his voice. "Where are you?" "I'm not a fugitive," Kirk replied smoothly, watching a pair of models walk past the pool. "I don't have anything to hide. I'm just being careful of my movements. The investors, particularly the NFL players, they were angry. I feared for my personal safety. I had to step away to protect myself. It was a brilliant sociopathic spin. He was casting himself as the victim of violent athletes rather than the architect of their financial ruin. What about the missing $150 million? The reporter pressed. Legitimate trading losses. Kirk lied without missing a beat. The market turned against us. It's a tragedy, but it's not a crime. He hung up the phone and tossed it into his beach bag. He felt a twisted sense of pride. He was still controlling the narrative. He was still Kirk Wright, the Harvard genius. But the FBI wasn't reading the Wall Street Journal for clues. They were tracking digital breadcrumbs. They had traced the burner phones. They had monitored the cash withdrawals. The net was closing. 30 minutes later, as Kirk signaled the waiter for another mojito, shadows fell over his lounge chair. He looked up. 3 men in casual clothes stood around him. They didn't look like tourists. They looked like men who carried heavy things for a living. The lead man reached into his polo shirt and produced a badge. Kirk Wright, the agent, asked. Kirk didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply let out a long, slow sigh. He reached up, removed his Tom Ford sunglasses, and placed them carefully on the small table next to his empty glass. Yes, Kirk said quietly. He stood up, offering his wrists. By all accounts, he didn't appear incredibly surprised. It was as if he had just been riding out the remaining days of a luxurious vacation, waiting for the bill to finally arrive. The illusion was over. Chapter 10, The Price of the Smile. Federal Courthouse, Cincinnati, January 2008. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with the hushed murmurs of reporters, former employees, and victims. Stephen Warshak sat at the defense table, wearing a tailored navy suit. His posture was rigid, but the arrogant smile of Smiling Bob was nowhere to be found. His trial had become a spectacle. His high-priced defense lawyers paced the floor, weaving a narrative of corporate victimhood. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the lead defense attorney implored. Stephen Warshak built a company from zero to $200 million in less than 8 years. This wasn't a scam. This was an American success story overwhelmed by its own rapid growth. They couldn't keep up with the processing errors. They did their best to fix it, but mistakes were made. It was the same lie Stephen had told John Bradley near the elevators years ago. Growing pains. But the federal prosecutors were armed with the 7 tons of evidence seized in the 2005 raid. They didn't need to argue about processing errors. They had Stephen's own words. The lead prosecutor approached the jury box, holding up a blown-up projection of an email. The defense claims this was an accident. The prosecutor said, his voice ringing with righteous anger, I put it to you that you do not accidentally rip off hundreds of thousands of people. You do it by design. He pointed to the screen. It was an email written by Stephen to his top executives. I don't care if the card is taken from Grandma's purse so Junior can buy some inside. The prosecutor read aloud, emphasizing every cruel word. If the card is good, I want a ship. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Stephen stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. But that is not the worst of it, the prosecutor continued, switching the slide. When customers tried to cancel, the company didn't apologize. They devised a scheme to trick them again. They spoofed medical clinic phone numbers. They lied to sick people. And when Jason Kosman, the defendant's nephew, outlined this beautiful scheme to exploit the shit out of them, like fish in a barrel, the prosecutor turned slowly, pointing directly at Stephen Warshak. The CEO of this company didn't fire him. He replied, the student has become the teacher. Our company was built on this kind of creative thinking. It was the kill shot. The trial, as many observers noted, was effectively over the moment that email was read. The prosecution had successfully proven that Berkeley Premium Nutraceuticals was not a supplement company. It was a criminal enterprise built on preying upon the insecurities of its victims. On February 22nd, 2008, Judge Arthur Spiegel banged his gavel. He looked down at Stephen Warshak with naked contempt. You did not merely take money, Judge Spiegel said, his voice echoing in the silent room. You preyed on people's deepest insecurities. You knew you could exploit them, and you did it with unparalleled greed. The sentence was staggering. Stephen Warshak was ordered to pay an astronomical $494 million in forfeiture, stripping him of every dime he had stolen and hidden. And then came the time. 25 years in federal prison. Stephen Warshak, the man who had promised immortality and endless vitality in a bottle, was being sent to a concrete cell where he would spend the rest of his vibrant years growing old, forgotten by the world he had tried to conquer. Chapter 11, Sudden Death. Atlanta, Georgia, May 2008. Kirk Wright sat in a holding cell at the Fulton County Jail. The Brioni suits were gone, replaced by the drab, coarse fabric of an institutional jumpsuit. On May 21st, 2008, a jury had convicted him on 47 counts of fraud and money laundering. His defense that the missing $150 million was simply the result of legitimate trading losses had crumbled under the weight of the fabricated statements he had personally typed out on his computer. He was 37 years old. He was facing decades in prison, potentially over 100 years. Yet, when his lawyers met with him just 20 minutes after the guilty verdict, Kirk seemed bizarrely upbeat. His pride, the core engine of his sociopathy, was still intact. He spoke of appeals, of deals, of outsmarting the system one last time. We can get a reduced sentence. Kirk had told his attorney, his eyes wide with a desperate, manic energy. I'll cooperate. I'll tell them where the money went. I'll give them names. But deep down, in the quiet, terrible hours of the night, Kirk knew the truth. There was no hidden treasure chest to trade for his freedom. The money was gone. It was in the Bentley that had been seized. It was in the marble floors of a house his wife had been evicted from. It was in the melted ice bars of a wedding that meant nothing. He was a proud, fiercely arrogant man. The prospect of spending the rest of his life in a cage, stripped of his status, his cars, and his aura of invincibility, was a reality his mind simply refused to process. He had always controlled the exit, He had always been the smartest guy in the room. 3 days after his conviction, the prison settled into the quiet rhythm of the weekend. Kirkwright was on a standard watch, but he was not under 24-hour surveillance. In the dim light of his cell, Kirk stood up. He took the thin, scratchy bedsheet from his cot. With the same methodical, cold precision he had used to forge bank statements, he tied one end of the sheet around his own neck. He tied the other end to the metal grate of the top bunk. He didn't leave a note. He didn't offer an apology to Calvin Paris, who had trusted him with his family's future. He didn't apologize to Steve Atwater, whose reputation he had used to ensnare his teammates. Kirkwright simply stepped off the edge, taking his secrets and the phantom fortunes of 500 investors into the dark. By the time the guards made their next rounds, the alchemist of Atlanta was dead. Chapter 12, The Ruins. The collapse of an empire leaves a crater. In Michigan, Bob and Ellie Price never saw a dime of the money Berkeley Nutraceuticals had drained from their account. But for Bob, it was never really about the $30 a month. It was about the dignity stolen from his wife when she was at her most vulnerable. It was the feeling of being treated like a mark. Others, like Brian, the customer who had taken in sight and received nothing but unauthorized credit card charges, joined a class action lawsuit against a $1 million settlement pool. He walked away with $17,000. It wasn't full restitution, but it was a victory of principle. He had stood up to the machine and won. But for the victims of Kirkwright, there were no class action victories. There was only Ash, Alan Ehrlich, the 71-year-old retiree who had done everything right, had to watch his wife put her work clothes back on and return to the labor force. They moved out of their home and into a rented condo. The money he had planned to live on for the rest of his life had evaporated into the humid Atlanta air. Calvin Paris, the man whose son had gone to Harvard with Kirk, was left grappling with a profound sense of betrayal. He had looked Kirk in the eye. He had believed the smile. I wanted to visit him in prison, Paris would say later, his voice heavy with unresolved grief and anger, I would have been at the sentencing. So I got robbed. I got robbed figuratively and literally. Kirkwright's suicide was viewed by his victims not as a tragedy, but as his final, most selfish act of final refusal to face the people he had destroyed. Two men to empires built on the fragile foundation of human desire. Stephen Warshak sold the illusion of youth. Kirkwright sold the illusion of guaranteed wealth. In the end, the only things they successfully manufactured were shattered lives, empty bank accounts, and a stark reminder that if something seems too good to be true, the price you pay for believing it might just be everything you have. Book 3, Echoes of Deceit. Chapter 13, The Confessions of a Cog. Cincinnati, Ohio, the aftermath. The sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room of the FBI field office in Cincinnati was a universe away from the chaotic, high-energy floor of the Berkeley call center. John Bradley sat at a metal table, a paper cup of lukewarm water untouched in front of him. Across from him sat a federal agents, their faces impassive, the thick manila folder resting between them. John was not wearing handcuffs, but he felt the crushing weight of confinement all the same. He was a shift leader, a mid-level manager. He hadn't orchestrated the continuity program, nor had he drafted the fish in a barrel emails, but he had enforced the policies. He had trained the reps to invoke the phantom, Michael Johnson. Mr. Bradley, the lead agent, began, opening the folder. We're not here to indict you today. We are here to understand the mechanics of the machine. You are the grease on the wheels. The agent slid a stack of call transcripts across the table. John recognized the highlighted sections immediately. They were his own interactions with desperate customers. I needed the job. John